Sarah Martinez sat quietly at the corner table of Murphy's bar, nursing her drink and watching the rain streak down the windows. She had chosen this spot deliberately, back to the wall, clear view of both exits, and close enough to the emergency exit that she could disappear if needed. Old habits died hard, even when she was trying to blend in as just another civilian. The bar was typical of any military town. Dimly lit, filled with smoke and the sound of clinking glasses. Country music playing softly in the background. Most of the patrons were service members from the nearby base, still in their uniforms or recently changed into civilian clothes. Sarah fit right in wearing jeans and a simple black t-shirt. Her long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than a local woman grabbing a drink after work. She had been in town for 3 weeks now, taking some well-deserved leave after her latest deployment. The mission details were classified, but it had been intense even by Navy SEAL standards. Her team had successfully extracted a high-value target from hostile territory, but the operation had taken its toll. She needed time to decompress, to remember what normal life felt like. Sarah had specifically chosen this small coastal town because it was quiet and unremarkable. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore, spent her mornings running along the beach, and her evenings reading or occasionally stopping by Murphy's for dinner. The locals had accepted her as just another newcomer, perhaps someone escaping a bad relationship or starting over. She preferred it that way. Tonight felt different, though. She had noticed the group of Marines the moment they walked in, 5 of them, loud and already several drinks into their evening. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing and the way they moved marked them as clearly as if they wore uniforms. Marines had a particular swagger, a confidence that came from their training and brotherhood. At first, they had kept to themselves, occupying a large table near the bar and sharing stories that grew louder with each round. Sarah recognized the pattern: young servicemen blowing off steam, bonding over shared experiences and complaints about their superiors. She had done the same thing countless times during her own career, though always with more discretion. The trouble started when one of them, a tall blonde with the build of a linebacker, noticed her sitting alone. She saw him nudging his friends and pointing in her direction. Their conversation shifted, becoming more animated as they debated something among themselves. Sarah could guess what they were discussing. Whether to approach the attractive woman sitting by herself, she considered leaving. Her instincts, honed by years of dangerous operations, were telling her that this situation could escalate quickly. But she was tired of running, tired of constantly looking over her shoulder and modifying her behavior because of what others might do. She was off duty, in civilian clothes, trying to live a normal life. She had every right to finish her drink in peace. The decision was made for her when the blonde Marine stood up and walked over to her table. His friends followed, forming a loose semicircle around her chair. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his early 20s. His eyes were bright with alcohol and the kind of confidence that came from being surrounded by his peers. "Hey there, beautiful," he said, his words slightly slurred. "You look lonely sitting here all by yourself. Why don't you come join us? We're celebrating. Just got back from deployment." Sarah looked up at him calmly, her expression neutral. "Thank you for the invitation, but I'm fine where I am." The Marine's smile faltered slightly. He clearly wasn't used to being turned down, especially not in front of his friends. "Come on, don't be like that. We're not asking for much, just some company. Buy you a drink, maybe dance a little." "I said no, thank you." Sarah's voice remained level, but there was a subtle steel in it that anyone with military experience would have recognized. Unfortunately, these Marines were too drunk and too focused on impressing each other to pick up on the warning. One of his friends, a shorter man with dark hair and tattoos covering his arms, stepped closer. "What's your problem? We're just trying to be friendly. No need to be such a cold fish." "There's no problem," Sarah replied, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her thigh where, in other circumstances, she would have a knife strapped. "I'm just here to have a quiet drink. I'm sure you can understand that." The bartender, an older man with gray hair and worried eyes, was watching the interaction from behind the bar. Sarah could see him reaching for something under the counter, Probably a phone to call for help or maybe a baseball bat. She hoped it wouldn't come to that. The blonde Marine leaned down, placing his hands on her table and bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. Look, sweetheart. We've been overseas for 8 months. 8 months without seeing a pretty face like yours. The least you could do is show a little appreciation for our service. Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the glazed look in his eyes that meant he was past the point of reasoning. Behind him, his friends were getting restless, feeding off each other's energy and the alcohol in their systems. The other patrons in the bar were starting to notice the commotion, some turning to watch while others pointedly looked away. I appreciate your service, Sarah said quietly, but that doesn't entitle you to my company. Please step back. Instead of backing off, the Marine reached out and grabbed her wrist. Stop being such a tease. We know you want to party with us. Don't play hard to get. That was the line. Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up to meet his eyes. For just a moment, her carefully maintained civilian facade slipped, and something cold and dangerous flickered across her face. The Marine was too drunk to notice, but the bartender saw it and took an involuntary step backward. Take your hand off me. Now. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the bar like a blade. The Marine's grip tightened instead of loosening. Or what? What's a little thing like you going to do about it? Sarah smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that her SEAL teammates would have recognized. The one that appeared just before she did something that would require extensive paperwork to explain later. You really don't want to find out, she said softly. The Marine's friends laughed at Sarah's quiet threat, thinking it was just empty bravado from a cornered woman. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had spent the last 8 years of her life learning how to kill people in more ways than they could imagine. Oh, we've got a tough girl here, the tattooed Marine said, grinning at his buddies. Maybe she thinks she knows karate or something. Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled. She had been in situations like this before, though usually in foreign countries, where the stakes were much higher. The difference was that those times, she had been armed and wearing body armor. Tonight, she had only her training and the element of surprise. The blonde Marine leaned even closer, his grip on her wrist becoming painful. Listen here, princess. We're Marines. We fight for a living. You really think you can take on all 5 of us? No, Sarah said quietly. I know I can. Before anyone could react, Sarah moved. Her free hand shot up in a sharp upward strike, the heel of her palm connecting with the blonde Marine's nose. The cartilage crunched audibly, blood immediately streaming down his face as he staggered backward, releasing her wrist. The other Marines froze for a split second, shocked by the sudden violence. That hesitation cost them dearly. Sarah was already in motion, rising from her chair with fluid grace. She grabbed her beer bottle by the neck and smashed it against the edge of the table, creating a jagged weapon. Jesus Christ, the tattooed Marine yelled, reaching for her. Sarah sidestepped his clumsy grab and drove her elbow into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for air, and she brought her knee up to meet his descending face. The impact dropped him to the floor, unconscious. The remaining 3 Marines were no longer laughing. They spread out, trying to surround her. But Sarah had already analyzed the space. She knew exactly where each table, chair, and obstacle was located. More importantly, she knew how to use them to her advantage. What the hell are you? The blonde Marine gasped, still holding his broken nose. Someone you really shouldn't have messed with, Sarah replied, backing toward the wall. She kept the broken bottle in her right hand while her left hand found a heavy glass ashtray on a nearby table. One of the Marines, a heavy-set man with a crew cut, charged at her from the left. Sarah threw the ashtray with deadly accuracy, catching him in the temple. He went down hard, his head bouncing off the floor with a sickening thud. The 4th Marine, thin and wiry with nervous eyes, was smarter than his friends. He had pulled out his cell phone and was trying to call for backup. Sarah couldn't allow that. She feinted toward the blonde Marine, causing him to flinch and stumble backward, then pivoted and threw herself at the man with the phone. They crashed into a table, sending chairs flying and glasses shattering on the floor. The Marine tried to wrap his arms around her, but Sarah drove the broken bottle toward his shoulder. He screamed and released her, blood soaking through his shirt. "Stop this!" the bartender yelled from behind the bar. "I'm calling the police." "Good idea," Sarah called back, not taking her eyes off the remaining Marines. "Tell them to bring an ambulance too." The blonde Marine had recovered enough to make another attempt. He came at her with a wild haymaker that would have knocked out most people if it had connected. Sarah ducked under the punch and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor. Before he could get up, she was on top of him. The broken bottle pressed against his throat. "Now," she said, breathing hard but still completely in control. "Are we done here? Or do you want to see what other tricks I know?" "Tricks?" The Marine stared up at her with wide, frightened eyes. Blood was still flowing from his nose, and he could feel the sharp glass against his neck. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Someone who was just trying to have a quiet drink," Sarah replied. "But since you asked so nicely earlier, I'll tell you. Petty Officer First Class, Sarah Martinez, United States Navy. I'm a member of SEAL Team 6. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the bar who had been watching the fight suddenly understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A woman who looked like she could be anyone's sister or girlfriend had just taken down 4 Marines without breaking a sweat. The blonde Marine beneath her went completely still. "SEAL Team 6? He repeated, his voice barely audible. "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "The same unit that took down bin Laden. We specialize in eliminating high-value targets and conducting missions that other units can't handle. Taking down 4 drunk Marines isn't even a warm-up exercise for me." The 5th Marine, who had been smart enough to stay back and watch the carnage, slowly raised his hands in surrender. "We didn't know," he said desperately. "We're sorry. We thought you were just what? Just a helpless civilian you could intimidate and assault?" Sarah's voice was cold as ice. "Is that what Marines do now? Harass women who are trying to mind their own business?" The tattooed Marine was starting to regain consciousness, groaning as he tried to sit up. Sarah glanced at him briefly, then looked back down at the man beneath her. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get your friends and leave. You're going to pay for any damage you caused, and you're never going to bother another woman in this bar again. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear," the blonde Marine gasped. Sarah studied his face for a moment, then slowly stood up, keeping the broken bottle in her hand. "Good. Now get out." The Marines helped each other to their feet, supporting the ones who were still unsteady. The heavyset man who had taken the ashtray to the head was conscious, but clearly concussed. They gathered around the door, looking back at Sarah with a mixture of fear and awe. "Ma'am," the 5th Marine said quietly, "for what it's worth, we really are sorry. We had too much to drink and we acted like idiots." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Apology accepted. But if I see any of you bothering women again, we'll have a much longer conversation." As the Marines filed out of the bar, supporting their wounded, the other patrons began to whisper among themselves. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations: amazement, disbelief, and a healthy dose of respect. She set the broken bottle down on the nearest table and walked back to her original seat. The bartender approached her cautiously, carrying a towel and a first aid kit. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah shook her head, checking her hands for cuts from the broken glass. "I'm fine. Sorry about the mess. Don't apologize," the bartender said firmly. "Those boys needed to learn some manners. I just never expected to see them get schooled quite like that." As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah felt the familiar weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. She had blown her cover, revealed her identity, and probably ended her peaceful vacation in this small town. Word would spread quickly about the Navy SEAL who had taken down 4 Marines in Murphy's bar. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their red and blue lights painting the wet street in alternating colors. Sarah had used the time to clean up her minor cuts and help the bartender straighten the furniture. Several patrons had offered to buy her drinks, but she politely declined. The last thing she needed was alcohol in her system when the authorities arrived. Officer Janet Coleman was the first through the door, followed by her partner, a younger man who looked fresh out of the academy. Coleman was in her 40s with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen everything a small town could offer. She took one look at the scene and sighed heavily. "Let me guess," Coleman said to the bartender. "Another fight between Marines and locals?" "Not exactly," the bartender replied, glancing at Sarah. This time, it was a little different. Coleman noticed the broken glass, overturned chairs, and bloodstains on the floor. "Looks like someone got hurt. Where are the injured parties?" They left about 15 minutes ago," Sarah said from her table. "Probably headed to the base medical facility." The officer turned her attention to Sarah, studying her carefully. "And you are?" "Sarah Martinez." "I was having a drink when 5 Marines decided to get aggressive." Coleman pulled out her notepad. "Aggressive how?" Sarah gave a concise account of what had happened, leaving out the more violent details. She mentioned that the Marines had been drinking heavily, that they had refused to take no for an answer, and that she had been forced to defend herself when they became physical. "So you're saying 5 Marines attacked you, and you fought them off by yourself?" Coleman's partner asked, skeptically. "That's exactly what happened," the bartender interjected. "I saw the whole thing. Those boys grabbed her first, and she was just defending herself." Coleman looked around the bar at the other witnesses, who all nodded in agreement. "Anyone else want to add anything?" An elderly man near the bar spoke up. "Officer, I've been coming here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. That young lady moved like lightning. Those Marines didn't know what hit them." "She said she was Navy SEALs," another patron added. "Team 6. Coleman's eyebrows went up. She had heard of SEAL Team 6, of course. Everyone had after the Bin Laden raid made headlines, but she had never actually met a member of the unit, and certainly hadn't expected to find one in Murphy's bar. "Is that true?" Coleman asked Sarah directly. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her orders were always to maintain operational security, to avoid revealing details about her unit or missions, but the cat was already out of the bag, and lying to a police officer would only make things worse. "Yes, ma'am. I'm currently on leave." Coleman stared at her for a long moment, then looked around the bar again. The damage suddenly made more sense. "Do you have any identification?" Sarah pulled out her military ID card and handed it over. Coleman examined it carefully, noting the special markings that indicated Sarah's security clearance and unit assignment. "Well, I'll be damned," Coleman muttered. "You really are Team 6. "Yes, ma'am. And 5 Marines really thought they could push you around? They were drunk and didn't know who I was. I tried to defuse the situation peacefully, but they escalated it." Coleman handed back the ID card and closed her notepad. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to need you to come down to the station and make an official statement. But between you and me, if those boys were stupid enough to assault a Navy SEAL, they got what they deserved." At the police station, Sarah found herself in an interview room with Coleman and a federal agent who had arrived from the regional FBI office. Agent Michael Torres was a serious man in his 30s with the bearing of someone who had dealt with military personnel before. "Miss Martinez," Torres began, "I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You're a member of one of our most elite special operations units, and you were involved in a bar fight with 5 Marines." "I was defending myself against an assault," Sarah corrected. "I tried to de-escalate the situation multiple times before it became physical." Torres consulted his notes. "According to the witnesses, you broke 1 Marine's nose, gave another a concussion, dislocated a 3rd one's shoulder, and knocked a 4th unconscious. They grabbed me first. They refused to leave me alone when I asked them politely. What was I supposed to do, let them drag me out of the bar?" "Of course not," Torres said quickly. "I'm not questioning your right to defend yourself. I'm just trying to understand how 5 trained Marines ended up in the hospital after confronting 1 woman." Coleman leaned forward. "Agent Torres, I think you're missing the point here. Those Marines assaulted a federal employee who was minding her own business. If she had been an FBI agent, would we be questioning her right to defend herself?" Torres considered this. "You're right, Officer Coleman. Miss Martinez, I apologize if my questions seemed accusatory. We're just trying to get a complete picture of what happened. I understand, Sarah replied. And I want to cooperate fully. But I also want to make sure that this incident doesn't reflect poorly on my unit or the Navy. Actually, Torres said, I think this incident reflects very well on both. You showed remarkable restraint by not seriously injuring 5 men who could have easily overpowered most people. They couldn't have overpowered me, Sarah said matter-of-factly. I'm trained to fight multiple opponents who are better armed and better positioned than I am. 5 drunk Marines in a bar were never really a threat. The agent made a note. Speaking of training, I'm curious about your background. How long have you been with SEAL Team 6? 3 years with Team 6 specifically, 8 years as a SEAL overall. I was one of the first women selected for the program when it opened to female candidates. Torres looked impressed despite himself. That's quite an achievement. I imagine the training was intense. 24 weeks of basic SEAL training, followed by 6 months of advanced tactical training, then 2 years of specialized operations training before being selected for Team 6. After that, continuous training and deployment cycles. What kind of missions do you typically handle? Sarah shook her head. I can't discuss operational details, Agent Torres. You understand. Of course, I had to ask. Coleman had been listening to the exchange with growing admiration. Miss Martinez, can I ask you something off the record? Sure. How did it feel? I mean, you must have been holding back a lot. Those Marines had no idea what they were dealing with. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Honestly, it felt good to not have to pretend to be helpless for once. I spend a lot of time trying to blend in, trying not to draw attention to myself. Sometimes it's nice to remind people that appearances can be deceiving. I bet, Coleman said. I've been a cop for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of women who had to learn to defend themselves the hard way. It's refreshing to meet someone who can handle herself so completely. Agent Torres closed his file. Miss Martinez, I don't think we need to pursue this any further. The witnesses all confirm that you were defending yourself against an unprovoked assault. The Marines involved will likely face disciplinary action from their command structure. What about the damage to the bar? Sarah asked. The base will cover that, Coleman said. It's standard procedure when service members cause trouble in town. As they wrapped up the interview, Torres had one more question. Miss Martinez, what are your plans now? Will you be staying in town? Sarah sighed. I was planning to finish my leave here, but I suspect that's not possible anymore. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves something like this. You might be surprised, Coleman said. This is a military town. People here understand that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. And after tonight, I guarantee no one is going to bother you again. Torres nodded in agreement. Plus, you might find that your reputation precedes you in a good way. Not many people can say they've met a real-life Navy SEAL. Sarah considered this as she gathered her things. Maybe Coleman was right. Maybe this incident would actually make her remaining time in town more peaceful, not less. After all, who would be stupid enough to bother someone who had just put 4 Marines in the hospital? As she left the police station, Sarah realized that she felt lighter somehow. For months, she had been carrying the weight of constantly hiding who she was, of pretending to be someone ordinary and unremarkable. Tonight, she had been able to drop the mask, even if only for a few minutes. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find 3 messages on her phone. The first was from her commanding officer, Captain Williams, who had apparently been contacted by the base commander about the incident. The second was from her teammate Jake Morrison, who had heard the story through the military grapevine and was alternately laughing and expressing concern. The third was from her sister Elena, a civilian who lived in California and had somehow already heard about the Navy SEAL bar fight through social media. Sarah decided to deal with her CO first. She called the secure number and waited for Captain Williams to pick up. Martinez, his gruff voice came through the line. I hear you've been making friends with the local Marines. Sir, I can explain. At ease, Martinez. I've already read the police report and spoken with the base commander. Those Marines are facing disciplinary action for conduct unbecoming. You, on the other hand, showed remarkable restraint. Sarah felt a wave of relief. Thank you, sir. That said, Martinez, you need to be more careful about operational security. Half the internet is talking about the female Navy SEAL who beat up 4 Marines. Your face is probably going to be on every military blog by tonight. Sarah winced. She had hoped the story would stay local, but apparently that was wishful thinking. Sir, should I return to base? Negative. You've got 2 weeks left on your leave, and you've earned it. Just try to keep a lower profile for the rest of your vacation. After hanging up with Captain Williams, Sarah checked social media and immediately regretted it. Someone had taken cell phone video of the aftermath of the fight, showing the Marines being helped out of the bar and Sarah calmly talking to the police. The video had been posted on multiple platforms with titles like, "Female Navy SEAL Destroys Marines in Bar Fight," and "Don't Mess with This Woman." The comments ranged from admiring to skeptical to downright hostile. Some people questioned whether the story was real. Others debated whether women should be allowed in combat units. And still others simply expressed amazement at what they had witnessed. Sarah quickly closed the apps and decided to focus on more immediate concerns. She had planned to spend the morning running on the beach. But when she stepped outside her apartment, she found a small crowd gathered on the street below. Apparently, word had spread about where she was staying, and people were hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Navy SEAL. Sarah retreated back to her apartment and called Jake Morrison instead. Holy shit, Sarah. Jake's voice boomed through the phone. You've become an internet sensation. The guys are calling you the barroom brawler of Team 6. It's not funny, Jake. My cover is blown, and now I can't even go for a run without people staring at me. Are you kidding? This is the best thing that could have happened. Do you know how hard it is for our unit to get positive press? Usually, we're either completely invisible or getting blamed for something that went wrong. This time, you're the hero of the story. Sarah had to admit he had a point. Most of their operations were classified, and when they did make the news, it was usually because something had gone wrong, or because politicians were arguing about their tactics. Besides, Jake continued, maybe it's time people knew that Team 6 isn't just a bunch of bearded guys who look like they belong on a motorcycle. Having a woman on the team changes the perception, and having a woman who can kick ass changes it even more. I just wanted to finish my vacation in peace, Sarah said. Peace is overrated. Listen, I'm forwarding you some emails from reporters who want to interview you. The Pentagon Public Affairs Office says you can talk to them if you want, as long as you don't discuss operational details. I don't want to do interviews. Think about it, Jake said. You could control the narrative. Right now, people are making up their own stories about what happened. Wouldn't it be better if they heard the truth from you? After Jake hung up, Sarah spent the rest of the morning thinking about his suggestion. She had always been a private person, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves rather than seeking attention. But maybe he was right about controlling the narrative. Around noon, there was a knock at her door. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw Officer Coleman standing in the hallway, holding a coffee cup and a box of donuts. Officer Coleman, Sarah said as she opened the door. What brings you here? I figured you might be feeling a bit trapped up here with all the attention downstairs. Thought you might like some coffee and a friendly face. Sarah invited her in, grateful for the company. Coleman looked around the small apartment, noting the sparse furnishings and the stack of books on the table. Pretty quiet lifestyle for someone with your job, Coleman observed. I like quiet, Sarah replied. It's a nice change from the usual chaos. I bet. So, what's next for you? Are you going to stick around town? Or has this whole thing scared you off? Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee and offered Coleman a seat. I'm honestly not sure. Part of me wants to pack up and disappear. Find somewhere else to finish my leave, but another part of me is tired of running from who I am. You know, Coleman said. I've been thinking about what happened last night. Those Marines learned an important lesson about making assumptions. Maybe the rest of the town could learn something too. What do you mean? Well, this is a military town. People here respect service members, but they also have some pretty fixed ideas about what a warrior looks like. You've challenged those assumptions in a big way. Coleman sipped her coffee and continued. I've been a cop for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of domestic violence cases, a lot of women who felt helpless because they thought they couldn't defend themselves against men who were bigger and stronger. What you did last night shows that training and skill can overcome size and strength. Sarah hadn't considered that perspective. You think last night could actually help other women? I think it already has. My daughter called me this morning. She's away at college. And she said her friends are all talking about the badass Navy SEAL who refused to be intimidated. Some of them are already looking into self-defense classes. That's actually pretty cool. It is. And you know what else? I bet those Marines will think twice before bothering another woman. Word gets around in the military community. They're probably going to be the butt of jokes for months about how they got their asses kicked by a woman half their size. Sarah smiled at that thought. I hope so. Coleman's radio crackled, and she listened to the dispatcher for a moment before responding. I have to go, she said, standing up. But Sarah, can I give you some advice? Sure. Don't let this incident define you negatively. What you did took courage, and it sent a message that needed to be sent. Be proud of who you are and what you've accomplished. After Coleman left, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, thinking about their conversation. Maybe Jake and Coleman were both right. Maybe this incident could be turned into something positive, something that challenged stereotypes and inspired other women. She pulled out her phone and looked at the list of interview requests Jake had forwarded. There were requests from military publications, mainstream news outlets, and even a few podcasts that focused on women in combat roles. Sarah selected 3 requests, one from a military magazine, one from a national news program, and one from a podcast called Women Warriors that featured interviews with female service members. She composed brief emails agreeing to phone interviews, with the stipulation that she wouldn't discuss classified operations or reveal details that could compromise security. As she hit send on the emails, Sarah felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. She had spent her entire military career operating in the shadows, invisible to the public eye. Now she was about to step into the spotlight and speak for herself, and potentially for other women who had chosen unconventional paths. The phone rang almost immediately. It was the producer from the Women Warriors podcast, eager to schedule an interview for that afternoon. The interview with Women Warriors podcast host Rachel Chen went better than Sarah had expected. Rachel was a former Marine herself, so she understood the military culture and didn't ask questions that would compromise operational security. Instead, she focused on Sarah's journey from civilian to Navy SEAL, the challenges she had faced as a woman in a male-dominated field, and what the bar incident represented in terms of breaking down stereotypes. Sarah, when you were growing up, did you ever imagine you'd end up in special operations? Rachel asked during their hour-long conversation. Not at all, Sarah replied honestly. I wanted to be a teacher, actually. But after 9/11, something changed for me. I felt like I needed to do something more direct to serve my country. What was the hardest part of SEAL training? Sarah considered the question carefully. Physically, it was all challenging. But the hardest part was probably dealing with the skepticism from some of the male candidates, and even some instructors. There was this constant feeling that I had to prove myself over and over again, that one mistake would be seen as evidence that women didn't belong there. And now you're with Team 6, which is considered the elite of the elite. How does that feel? It feels like validation, I guess. Like proof that the people who doubted women's ability to perform at this level were wrong. But mostly, it just feels like doing the job I was trained to do. The interview was posted online that evening, and within hours it had thousands of downloads. Sarah found herself reading comments from women who said they were inspired by her story, from military families who appreciated her service, and from fellow service members who expressed pride in her accomplishments. But not all the feedback was positive. There were also comments questioning whether women should be in combat roles, whether her story was exaggerated, and whether she had been too aggressive in dealing with the Marines. Some people suggested that she should have tried harder to de-escalate the situation without violence. The criticism stung, but Sarah reminded herself that controversy meant people were talking about important issues. If her story sparked debates about women in combat, military culture, and self-defense, then maybe some good would come of it. The next morning, she decided to venture out of her apartment for the first time since the incident. She needed groceries, and she couldn't hide forever. To her surprise, the crowd outside had dispersed, though she did notice a few people taking pictures with their phones as she walked to her car. At the grocery store, Sarah tried to shop quietly and efficiently, but she was recognized almost immediately. Instead of the harassment she expected, most of the interactions were positive. A young woman working as a cashier asked for an autograph for her brother who was in the army. An elderly veteran thanked her for her service and told her that his granddaughter was considering joining the military because of her example. The most meaningful encounter came as she was loading groceries into her car. A woman in her 30s approached hesitantly, holding the hand of a young girl who looked to be about 10 years old. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Sarah Martinez? The Navy SEAL?" Sarah nodded, wondering if this was going to be another criticism about her handling of the bar situation. "I wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "My daughter Emma has been dealing with bullies at school. Boys who think they can push her around because she's small and quiet. When she heard about what you did, something changed in her. She asked me to sign her up for martial arts classes." Emma stepped forward shyly. "My mom says you're the toughest person in the world. Is that true?" Quote, Sarah knelt down to Emma's eye level. "I'm not the toughest person in the world, Emma. But I did train really hard to learn how to protect myself and other people. The most important thing isn't being tough, it's being brave enough to stand up for what's right. Were you scared when those men were mean to you?" Sarah considered lying, giving the kind of answer adults usually gave children to make them feel better. Instead, she decided on honesty. "A little bit. Yes. But being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." Emma's mother had tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to Sarah. "You have no idea how much this means to her." As they walked away, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that her actions had meaning beyond the immediate mission. In the military, success was usually measured in tactical objectives achieved or threats eliminated. But this was different. This was about inspiring a 10-year-old girl to stand up for herself. That afternoon, Sarah received a call that surprised her. It was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking female officer in Naval Special Warfare Command. "Petty Officer Martinez, I've been following the coverage of your incident," Colonel Hayes said. "I wanted to personally commend you for how you've handled the situation." "Thank you, ma'am. I also wanted to discuss an opportunity with you. The Pentagon is looking for someone to represent Naval Special Warfare at a series of recruitment events focused on encouraging more women to consider special operations careers. After this week, you've become something of a public figure. Would you be interested in taking on this role?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm the right person for public relations work. I prefer operational assignments." "I understand that, Martinez. But consider this. How many young women out there might choose not to pursue military careers because they think they're not tough enough or skilled enough? Your story shows them that with the right training and determination, they can achieve anything. Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course. But Martinez, what you did in that bar wasn't just about defending yourself. Whether you intended it or not, you struck a blow against every stereotype about women in combat. The least we can do is use that moment to open doors for the next generation." After hanging up with Colonel Hayes, Sarah walked out onto the small balcony of her apartment and looked out at the ocean. For 3 weeks, she had been trying to disconnect from her military identity, to just be a regular person on vacation. But the events of the past few days had shown her that she couldn't separate who she was from what she did. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Morrison. "Saw your interview online. The whole team is proud of you. You've made us all look good." Another message came from her sister Elena. "Little sister, you've always been my hero. But now the whole world knows it too." As the sun set over the ocean, Sarah made her decision about Colonel Hayes' offer. She would take the assignment, not because she wanted fame or attention, but because she realized that her story belonged to more than just herself. It belonged to every woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough, every girl who had been taught to be afraid, and every person who had ever been underestimated because of their appearance. The bar incident had started as a simple case of self-defense, but it had become something larger, a symbol of what was possible when training met determination, when skill overcame assumptions, and when someone refused to be a victim. Sarah Martinez had spent her military career protecting her country in the shadows. Now, she would serve in the light, showing others that they too could find strength they didn't know they possessed. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of an auditorium filled with 300 high school students at a military academy in Virginia. She wore her dress blue uniform with its rows of ribbons and the distinctive seal trident pin on her chest. The students, both male and female, watched her with rapt attention as she concluded her presentation about opportunities in naval special warfare. "The most important thing I want you to understand," Sarah said, wrapping up her talk, "is that special operations isn't about being the biggest or the strongest person in the room. It's about being the most prepared, the most determined, and the most willing to push beyond what you thought were your limits." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Miss Martinez, is it true that you really beat up 4 Marines in a bar?" Sarah smiled. This question came up at every event, no matter how much she tried to focus on other topics. "It's true that I defended myself against an assault. But that incident has been blown out of proportion. The real story isn't about a bar fight. It's about the importance of training, preparation, and having the confidence to stand up for yourself when it matters." Another student, a young man near the back, raised his hand. "Do you think having women in special operations makes the teams weaker?" It was a question Sarah had heard many times before, and she had developed a standard response that was both diplomatic and firm. Performance in special operations isn't determined by gender, it's determined by individual capability. I've served alongside some of the most elite warriors in the world, and I can tell you that what matters is whether you can complete the mission, protect your teammates, and maintain the highest standards of professionalism. After the presentation, Sarah met with individual students who had specific questions about military careers. One conversation particularly stood out: a 17-year-old named Maria Santos, who was considering applying to the Naval Academy. "I want to be a SEAL like you," Maria said earnestly. "But my parents think it's too dangerous. And my boyfriend says I should do something more traditional." Sarah recognized something of her younger self in Maria's determined expression. "What do you think?" "I think I can do anything if I train hard enough and want it badly enough. I've been running cross-country since I was 14. I'm in the top 10% of my class academically. And I've been doing martial arts for 3 years. Those are all good foundations," Sarah agreed. "But are you prepared for the possibility that you might fail? The attrition rate for SEAL training is over 80%. Most people don't make it through, regardless of how prepared they think they are." Maria nodded seriously. "I know the odds. But I also know that someone has to make it through, right? Why not me?" Sarah smiled at the girl's confidence. "That's exactly the right attitude. Here's my advice. Apply to the academy. Focus on your physical and academic preparation. And don't let other people's limitations become your own. The military needs people who are willing to push boundaries." As Sarah drove back to her hotel that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that night in Murphy's bar. The recruitment assignment had led to other opportunities. She had been featured in a documentary about women in special operations, had testified before Congress about military personnel policies, and had even been invited to speak at corporate leadership conferences about overcoming obstacles and challenging assumptions. But the most rewarding part of her new role was the letters and emails she received from young women who said her story had inspired them to pursue careers they had never considered before. Some were joining the military, others were entering fields like law enforcement or firefighting, and still others were simply standing up for themselves in situations where they previously might have remained silent. Her phone rang as she pulled into the hotel parking lot. It was Captain Williams, calling with her next assignment. "Martinez, how did the academy presentation go?" "Very well, sir. Good turnout, engaged students, lots of thoughtful questions. Excellent. I have something new for you. The Secretary of the Navy wants you to lead a working group on integrating women into more special operations roles. It would mean a promotion to Chief Petty Officer and a transfer to the Pentagon. Sarah was quiet for a moment. A Pentagon assignment was prestigious and would advance her career significantly. But it would also mean leaving operational units permanently. Trading fieldwork for policy development. Sir, can I ask what sparked this initiative? Your story, actually. The Secretary has been getting pressure from Congress and women's advocacy groups to expand opportunities for female service members. Your success with Team 6 has become a case study for what's possible when we remove artificial barriers. I appreciate the confidence, sir. But I'm not sure I want to leave operational assignments permanently, Captain Williams chuckled. Martinez, you've been out of operational rotation for 6 months, doing recruitment events. You're already changing the military in ways that are probably more important than any single mission you could complete. How so, sir? Do you know how many women have applied for SEAL training since your story went public? The numbers have tripled. And not just for SEALs, applications for all special operations programs are up significantly among female candidates. Sarah hadn't realized the impact had been that measurable. What's the success rate? Too early to tell for most of them. But the first group to go through BUD/S training had a completion rate twice as high as previous female candidates. Turns out having a role model makes a difference. As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about Maria Santos and the hundreds of other young women she had met over the past months. Each of them was taking risks, challenging expectations, and refusing to accept limitations that others tried to place on them. Sir, if I take this assignment, would I have the authority to make real changes, or would I just be writing reports that sit on shelves? The Secretary has given this working group significant authority to recommend policy changes. And given the political attention around these issues, I suspect most of your recommendations will be implemented. Sarah made her decision. I'll take the assignment, sir. Outstanding. Oh, and Martinez, there's one more thing. The President wants to meet with you next month. Something about a ceremony recognizing Americans who have broken barriers and inspired others. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her car for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been an anonymous operator, conducting classified missions in foreign countries. Now she was about to meet the President and help shape policy for the entire military. It had all started with one night in a bar, when 5 Marines had made the mistake of thinking they could intimidate someone based on their assumptions about what a warrior looked like. They had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, that training and skill mattered more than size and swagger, and that the person sitting quietly in the corner might be more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Sarah started her car and drove toward her hotel, already thinking about the speech she would give at the Pentagon ceremony next week. She would talk about the importance of judging people by their capabilities rather than their appearance, about the value of diversity in building strong teams, and about the responsibility that came with breaking down barriers for others. But mostly, she would talk about the night when her carefully maintained cover was blown, and how it had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her career. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the moments that seem like disasters turn out to be exactly what you needed to find your true purpose. The quiet Navy SEAL who had just wanted to finish her vacation in peace had become a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity. And she was just getting started.